All right, we are going to dive in tonight. I brought a stool because I'm going to read a story. So some of you may have heard this before, but it was like, trying to think, probably about 7 years ago or so. I was at Rock Harbor and I was teaching a series on Luke, and I got to the story at the end of Luke, that the Easter Sunday story, where Jesus is on these two disciples are on a walk discussing the resurrection and everything that's just happened, and then Jesus appeared to them. And I remember reading that story, and I was getting ready to turn it into a sermon. You know what pastors do, like trying to explain some of the stuff and come up with a couple of main points out of it. And I just remember feeling like anything I did to that story would be causing damage to the story, because I'd rip it apart and make it a 3-point message and whatever else. And it's just so, the word that came to mind at the time was magical. It's just this light and airy story where Jesus is almost playful, like he's messing with them. And I just couldn't quite justify tearing the story apart. So I asked permission to just turn it into a historical narrative, where we basically just rewrite the story, kind of flesh out some of the backstory of some of the characters, kind of do like a historical fiction take where you can weave some history and some culture into it. And so I remember I wrote that, and I ended up at Rock Harbor sitting on a stool in front of the church and read it, and it went over pretty well. So I ended up doing 2 more of them. One is one that you're going to hear tonight, which is on the Palm Sunday story. And then I have one on, they all happen to, not on purpose, but happen to fall within the Holy Week. So there's one for Palm Sunday, one for Good Friday, and one for Easter Sunday. So we figured in honor of Palm Sunday, I would share with you this story. If you are a fan of The Chosen, it's going to sound kind of that same vibe. I promise I wrote these before The Chosen came out. They ripped me off, not the other way around, okay? Just kidding. I remember thinking at the time, though, we should do like a series of these. That'd be so cool. And then they beat me to it, and the rest is history. Okay, here we go. So, yeah. I should give you a little background. The main character in this story is a guy named Simon. He's one of the 12 disciples, not Simon Peter, but we know him now as Simon the Zealot, which a zealot was like a patriot, a Jewish patriot who was willing to use violence in rebellion against Rome to take their country back from the Romans. So Simon the Zealot is our main character. Simon awoke to the sound of metal scraping on stone. He slowly opened his eyes and lifted his head. For a few groggy moments, his mind struggled to process the unfamiliar environment. A dim room lit by only a thin, dusty beam of sunlight streaming through a small window overhead. 3 blank stone walls, all within arm's reach, and on the 4th, a large, rough wooden door with thick iron hinges and no handle. The cold floor beneath him was made of the same stone as the walls, and as the ache in his back testified, was a poor substitute for a mattress. It was actually the aches, every inch of his body hurt, more than the sights that reminded him where he was, the aches and that sound of metal on stone. With recognition of his surroundings came panic. The rush of adrenaline jolted his body awake, but his mind still struggled to escape the fog of sleep. Instinct took over. His body tensed, his face flushed. His heart pounded fast and loud in his ears. He popped to his knees, ready to run, but as he tried to rise to his feet, his aching arms gave out on him, and he fell with a grunt to the ground. He lay for a moment on his face, his breath coming in gasps. After a few powerless moments, a voice, more a thought, cut through the fog. "Where did you think you were going to go?" He lay on his face for a moment, gasping for air before rolling back over, and with great difficulty propping himself up on his elbows. Once again, he took in his surroundings, this time with a somewhat clearer head. Walls, windows, door, no handle. The voice again, "Be still." He lowered himself gently down, his head back against the stone floor, closed his eyes, and began to breathe each breath a prayer. "Be near. I'm scared. I need you." For a few moments, his fear fought back, but it was soon replaced by a deep sense of peace and a deep sense of presence. Fear, Simon had learned long ago, was no match for the overwhelming love that had become the bedrock of his life. Before long, his breathing slowed, the cold stone floor cooled his flushed skin, his pulse quieted, and the haze lifted. He opened his eyes, and his gaze fell on the inset window. From this angle, he could see only a sliver of sky, bright blue, interrupted occasionally by a rustle of green as the fronds of a palm tree waved gently in the breeze. Despite the circumstances, a smile crept across his face. Palm trees always had that effect on him. So many memories. They reminded him of his father. His dad, Judah, had always been his hero. Everything that he'd wanted to be: strong, brave, faithful, patriotic. A blacksmith by trade, he'd moved his family from Jerusalem to the Galilee to be a part of the Jewish resistance movement, the Zealots. Financially, this was a bad decision, as the economy in Galilee under the empire was even worse than in Jerusalem. However, Judah was not one to be motivated by money. He figured he could be a valuable asset to the liberation movement in Galilee by equipping the militia with the weapons necessary to win back their country from the Romans. Simon could still picture his father working the forge late at night and his mother begging him to knock off the racket so his children could sleep. "The kingdom is more important than sleep," Judah responded. "Besides, the kids can sleep through anything." And he was right. Far from keeping him awake, the clanging of his dad's hammer on the anvil was like a lullaby to him, which might explain why he'd struggled with insomnia ever since his father had passed away. When Simon turned 10 years old, his father decided it was time for him to start learning the family business. His mother protested that he was too young, but on this one occasion, her pleas did nothing to change her husband's mind. Judah was resolute. So before dawn the following morning, Simon helped pack up the cart with some of his father's work: horseshoes, nails, farm tools, a few decorative pieces, and several long burlap wrapped packages that his father carefully tucked underneath everything else. And they headed to the market in Sepphoris. His mother looked on with a worried expression as the cart pulled away. They arrived in Sepphoris mid-morning and quickly set up the cart to display all their products, except those long burlap packages. And then they waited. To say that business was poor would have been quite an understatement. Business was difficult for everyone under the Roman occupation. Everyone, that is, except those who had sold their souls to the Romans to turn a profit, like the traitorous tax collectors. They spent the rest of the morning and afternoon standing next to the cart without making a single sale. That's not to say they weren't busy, though. All day long, men stopped by to chat with his father, looking over their shoulders and speaking in hushed tones. They talked about the latest rumors out of Jerusalem and Rome, about troop movements and taxes, about empire and resistance. Simon understood very little of their words, but he understood their emotions: sadness, anger, longing, hope. Occasionally, Judah would grab one of the burlap packages from their cart and discreetly hand it to one of the men, who would quickly tuck it beneath his robe and hurry off across the market as nonchalantly as possible. It was that day that Simon began to realize that there was more to the family business than selling horseshoes and farm tools. Around 4 p.m, they packed up the cart to head home. However, rather than taking the road north out of town back to Bethsaida, they headed south toward Nazareth. Simon asked his father where they were going, but Judah simply said, "I have something I need to show you." They weren't far out of Sepphoris when they saw the first of the crosses, lining the road on either side. Simon asked his father what they were seeing, what it meant, but his father simply kept walking in silence with a somber look on his face. As they continued on, so did the crosses, stretching into the distance on either side of the road as far as their eyes could see. There must have been hundreds of them. Large frames of rough wood darkened at the edges. When they reached the end of the row of crosses, Judah stopped and turned, his tear-filled eyes catching the light of the setting sun. 10 years ago, the year you were born, Judah began, a group of Jewish patriots managed to defeat the legion garrisoned at Sepphoris and reclaim the town. But their success was short-lived. A Roman general named Varus learned about the uprising, marched on Sepphoris, and recaptured the town. He burned it to the ground and then crucified 2,000 freedom fighters on these crosses. He ordered that the crosses be left standing along the road as a warning to anyone who dared to defy the empire. He stood silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice cracked with emotion. "Never again. Next time we rise up against them, they will fall." He reached into the pocket of his tunic and pulled out a small object and handed it to Simon. It was a bronze coin. Simon had never seen anything like it. On one side, a profile of a man wearing a helmet, ready for battle, and on the other side, a palm tree. His father anticipated his question. "No, it's not Roman. It's one of ours. Hasmonean from the Maccabees, from the last time we ruled our own nation. The Romans consider it treason even to own this coin. The man on the front is Judas Maccabee, the hero of the revolt against the Greeks. And on the back, the palm tree, is the symbol of his reign. When he liberated Jerusalem, the whole city turned out for a parade. Children climbed palm trees and collected branches just like these, and the whole crowd waved them over Judas and the Israelite army, our army, as they entered the city. This, Judah said, pointing at the tree, is the symbol of our victory. It is slow in coming, but it's certain. One day, Messiah will come, and on that day, God will once again fight for his people. Simon's father's eyes lifted to the heavens as he began to recite. Then the Lord will appear over them. His arrow flashed like lightning. The sovereign Lord will sound the trumpet, and he will march in the storms of the south, and the Lord Almighty will shield them. They will destroy and overcome with sling stones. They will drink and roar as with wine. They will be like a bowl used for sprinkling the corners of the altar. The Lord their God will save his people on that day as a shepherd saves his flock. They will sparkle in his land like jewels in a crown. Judah looked back at his son, his eyes filled with zeal and love. The palm branches will wave again, my son. I pray that you'll be there to see it. That was the day Simon took up the family business. That was the day he became Simon the Zealot. And now he was laying on a cold stone floor in a locked room somewhere in Persia, listening to the maddening sound of metal against stone. Well, Simon thought, my father's prayer was answered. I was there that day when the palm branches waved again. But Simon had a feeling that had his father lived to see that day, he would have been disappointed. Because the kingdom that was inaugurated with the waving of those palm branches was certainly not the kingdom Judah the blacksmith had been expecting. It certainly wasn't the kingdom Simon had been expecting. Honestly, there were still plenty of days when the kingdom that had come on that day didn't make any sense to Simon at all. Days like today. So he prayed a prayer that he'd learned a long time ago and that had carried him through his life ever since. Lord, your kingdom over mine. It was often painful to say those words, some days more than others, days like today. It always cost something. But Simon had seen over and over again that the reward far outweighed the cost, that the kingdom he gave was nothing compared to the kingdom he received. His eyes drifted back to the window, the sliver of blue, the palm branch. He remembered the day he realized that those two kingdoms, his and Jesus's, were two different things. They'd been sitting near a stand of palm trees on the outskirts of the town, near the border between Samaria and Galilee, when they'd stopped to gather supplies. Simon didn't really like being this close to Samaria, but their growing army needed food. So Jesus sent a small group of disciples into town, while the rest of them relaxed under a grove of palm trees. Of course, they weren't able to relax for long because word of Jesus, this rabbi, prophet, miracle man, Messiah, had spread across the entire region. And as soon as people from the town heard that Jesus was in the area, they flocked to him. Jesus didn't seem terribly concerned with the mobs of people jostling against him, vying for his attention, but his closest disciples, Simon included, felt it necessary to assume crowd control duty. Particularly annoying were the people who insisted on bringing their snot-nosed, screaming children with them, asking Jesus to lay his hands on them and bless them. They knew as well as he did that their children weren't worth the rabbi's time. The kingdom of God was at hand. Children were absolutely worthless in this cause. Jesus didn't need children, he needed warriors. Simon said as much, in not so many words, to a woman holding a dirty, half-naked toddler and firmly but gently moved her away from Jesus. Hey! He heard an angry voice over his shoulder, and he turned to find himself face to face with a livid Jesus. His eyes burned with an intensity that made the breath catch in Simon's throat. Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Truly I tell you, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it. Jesus firmly, not gently, moved Simon out of the way, and he rushed to the child, took her in his arms, and smiled. Simon couldn't believe how quickly his face had changed. Rage at Simon was replaced with doting affection. His eyes no longer burned but twinkled. Simon, who had given up everything to follow Jesus, who was willing to die for the cause, who was only trying to protect Jesus, was pushed to the side with contempt. Yet this worthless child, who could do nothing for Jesus, who only wanted from Jesus, was embraced. Simon had almost walked away from Jesus for good that day. He stormed back to his tent, packed his few belongings into a sack, slipped on his tunic, and started walking. He didn't know where he was going, just away from here. As he walked, he told himself that he was making the right choice. He wasn't leaving because Jesus had hurt his feelings. He was leaving because he was beginning to get the distinct impression that Jesus wasn't the one he'd been waiting for, that the kingdom he longed for and the kingdom Jesus would bring were the same in name only. And it wasn't just the incident with the snot-nosed kid. Over the course of 3 years that Simon had spent with Jesus, he'd compiled a long list of things that he wished Jesus hadn't said or done. There was the conversation with Jesus on the hillside overlooking the lake. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the peacemakers. What use did men like these have for meekness? They hadn't signed on with Jesus to make peace, but to wage a righteous war. That conversation got even worse. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek also. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go 2 miles. You've heard it said, love your enemy, or love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. They'd all been struck, had all been forced to walk countless miles. And the last thing they wanted to hear their Messiah say was to pray for their persecutors. Sometimes Jesus simply didn't measure up to their expectations of what a Messiah should be. Then there were other times where he exceeded those expectations in some pretty troubling ways, like when he said, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, or friend, your sins are forgiven, or before Abraham was, I am. These were particularly hard for Simon to understand. Jesus didn't seem insane to him, well, at least not at the time, but claiming to be God walking around in the flesh, which, make no mistake about it, was exactly what Jesus was doing. That was something only a crazy person would do. Especially when he said things God would never say, like encouraging them to pay taxes to the Roman government, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's. Or when he did things that God would never do, like healing a Roman centurion's servant, and then going a step farther and saying, I haven't found anyone in Israel with such great faith. Truly, I tell you, many will come from the east and the west to take their place at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown out into darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Who did he think he was? As a younger man, Simon had started fights over far less. He knew men who had killed for less. Worst of all was Matthew. The people Jesus associated with always bothered Simon. He shunned the attention of the rich and powerful, who, from Simon's perspective, were exactly the kind of people they needed to fund their campaign. But he hung out with the poor, the diseased, the useless, the unclean, and the sinners. And all that was bad enough, but when he started inviting those people to be a part of their crew, Simon just about lost his mind. Matthew was a tax collector, a traitor to his own people, yet Jesus called him in and put him on the same level as the rest of them. This isn't what Simon had signed up for. And he wasn't the only one who was upset about it. The decision just about broke up their crew. Rocky, you know him as Peter, the Thunder Twins, as everyone called them behind their backs, Judas Iscariot, that is Judas the Dagger, Simon the Zealot. People venerated them now, well, not Judas, but as saintly pillars of the church. But when Jesus called them, they were all brawlers. All of them had joined Jesus to be a part of a revolution, not to hang out with Roman sympathizers, with traitors. Sometimes Simon thought he understood why Judas Iscariot had done what he did. He didn't condone it, but he understood. As he walked away from Jesus, Simon's hands subconsciously drifted to the hidden pocket sewn into his tunic where he kept his father's coin. The feeling of the smooth edges of the palm branches against his thumb usually comforted him, but today it just added to his inner turmoil. Jesus was constantly disappointing, frustrating, confusing, or just infuriating him. Yes, he was perfectly justified in walking away, but he just couldn't. Despite all his flaws, there was just something about Jesus, a gravity that Simon couldn't escape. And he couldn't quite figure out what it was. Yes, he was charismatic, bold, and brave, and of course there was the power, the undeniable power. Simon had seen the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers cleansed, the deaf hear, even the dead raised. But as wonderful as it was to witness all that, it still wasn't why he had stayed. Really, the only way he could explain it is that he had nowhere better to go. Even when Jesus made him angrier than he'd ever been, the thought of being anywhere else just seemed gray, colorless, lifeless, completely uninteresting. So, after a few hours, well after sundown, he found himself back at the camp in the darkness. He tried to slip off to his tent unnoticed, but Jesus spotted him across the campfire and called him over. Simon cringed, expecting a lecture, or maybe he hoped an apology. He didn't get either. Instead, Jesus just offered him a plate of food. "You missed dinner," he said. "Where'd you go?" Simon dared not tell him the truth, so he simply responded, "I went for a walk. Needed to clear my head." "Simon," Jesus asked, "why did you come back?" Simon's face flushed with embarrassment. With one simple question, Jesus had exposed him and put his finger on Simon's raw nerve. There was no rebuke or anger in Jesus' voice, only sincerity. Yet Simon was afraid to be completely honest. How could he tell Jesus that he was angry with him, confused by him, disappointed in him? How could he say that he wasn't sure why he kept coming back? That he came back because he had nowhere better to go, so he gave a safe answer. Again, true, but not the whole truth. "I came back because I want to be a part of building the kingdom." Jesus looked at him for a moment with a sad sort of compassion in his eyes. "My kingdom or yours?" Laying on the floor, his head started to hurt a bit from the hard stone floor. Simon repeated his answer to Jesus' question. "Your kingdom over mine." The sound of metal against stone had stopped, replaced by the buzz of a growing crowd. They were here to watch him. It wouldn't be long now. His hands drifted back to the hidden pocket in his tunic. He knew he wouldn't find anything there, but it still comforted him. The empty pocket reminded him of that day, the day when the palm branches waved again. Simon remained conflicted after his conversation with Jesus in the weeks that followed. But as they got closer to Jerusalem, the crowds grew, the buzz grew, and Simon found himself getting swept up in the excitement of it all. And when they were about 2 miles outside of Jerusalem, Jesus sent a few of them ahead to the village of Bethpage. "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you'll find a donkey tied there, with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. And if anyone says anything to you, just say the Lord needs them, and he'll send them right away." In that moment, all Simon's doubts about Jesus were laid to rest. Yes, he had said and done some troubling things, but Simon was willing to chalk it all up to eccentricity because now Jesus was getting down to business. This was the moment Simon had been waiting for his whole life. The moment all of them had been waiting for generations. Ever since he could remember, his father had regaled him with stories about the Messiah who would come and free them from Roman oppression and usher in the kingdom of heaven, and always at the center of those stories was a donkey. "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt the foal of a donkey. Then the Lord will appear over them, his arrow flashing like lightning. Then the Lord God will save his people on that day as a shepherd saves his flock." The king on a donkey seemed a strange image for anyone who'd seen a Roman cavalryman riding a massive war horse. But this was the image that Zechariah the prophet had given them, the image that God had given them. So as long as he knew God was in it, Simon wasn't overly concerned about the comedy of the visual, the Messiah on a humble beast of burden. Yes, the Roman legionnaires might laugh when they saw it, but Simon would be the one laughing when the legions had been routed and the empire put to flight, and the king had ascended his throne exalted above the nations. Simon, sitting at his right hand, he didn't care what James or John thought. He knew he would be the greatest. This was the best day of his life, the best day of all their lives. The mood was electric, the crowd swelling larger and larger by the moment. The disciples laughed and sang and beat their chests. The children danced. Some of the older folks in the crowd wept openly, sobs as the pain of generations and the joy of imminent victory mingled in this one moment. It was a tempest of powerful feeling. Simon stopped dancing for a moment just to take it all in. He looked across the crowd, feeling everything they were feeling: excitement, pride, apprehension, hope, joy. Then across the sea of people, he saw Jesus, seated atop the donkey, a small eye of calm in the middle of a hurricane of emotion. It was hard to tell from where he sat, but Simon thought Jesus looked almost sad. How could he be sad at a time like this, Simon thought. The spring in his step temporarily dampened by his rabbi's moodiness, Simon worked his way through the crowd to Jesus. "Teacher, the day is finally here. The time has come." Jesus looked at him with what Simon thought were the saddest eyes he'd ever seen. He sat on that donkey, the focal point of wild celebration, but he was absolutely dejected. The crowd danced around him with the lightest of feet, yet Jesus looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Yes, Simon," he said somberly, "the kingdom is at hand. Then why aren't you celebrating, Lord? Simon asked, confused and slightly annoyed. Look at this crowd. We're all here because of you. We'll follow you anywhere. Jesus simply looked at him. Will you follow me anywhere? It seemed a silly question to ask someone who'd followed him for over 3 years. Of course, Lord. I've given up everything to follow you. Jesus looked at him for what seemed like an eternity, his face an agonizing blend of love and sorrow. Not everything, Jesus said. Simon, give me your coin. His heart stopped. What coin, he stalled. I don't have any money. Judas keeps all the money, Lord. How could Jesus possibly know about the coin tucked into the hidden pocket of his tunic? Jesus extended his hand, rough and strong, a stonemason's hand. Your father's coin, he replied. Simon had no desire to do anything of the sort. He'd already given so much to the cause. He'd already given so much to Jesus. How could Jesus ask this of him? Then again, how could he refuse? After all, this man standing before him was to be crowned king. And when a king commands, his subjects obey. So Simon put his hand into his pocket, removed the coin from its hiding spot, and placed it in Jesus' hand. His heart broke. He caught one last glimpse of the palm branches before Jesus closed his hand and turned the donkey down the road, which led to Jerusalem and the coming kingdom. The parade down the Mount of Olives did little to restore Simon's good mood. This was supposed to be the best day of his life, but all he felt was loss and an impending sense of doom. He tried to talk himself out of it, to get back into the spirit of the moment. After all, it was just a coin, but suddenly he was an outsider in his own dreams. He looked around him at all the people celebrating a moment he longed for his entire life. Everything was just as he pictured it. People dancing and singing, throwing their robes on the ground, waving palm branches overhead, absolutely unconcerned about the knot of Roman soldiers, observing warily from the distance. Everything about it was right. Yet Simon couldn't shake the feeling that it was all wrong, that they were all missing it entirely, only he had no idea what it was. He was swept along by the crowd, a lone mourner in a victory parade. 5 days later, Jesus was dead and buried in a borrowed tomb. The worst day of his life. Even all these years later, even knowing what would happen next, Simon still wept at the memory of that day, tears streaming down his face and falling to the cold stone floor. They were complicated tears. Sorrow and joy flowed together. He had lost something that day. He had lost everything that day, but that wasn't the end of the story. Because 2 days after he died, Jesus rose from the dead. Simon didn't believe it when the women told him what they'd seen, but a few hours later, he saw it too. They were in a locked room, and then suddenly Jesus was there with them. It took them several hours to accept that what they were seeing was real, and several months after that to recover from the shock of it all. They had seen some crazy things in their time with Jesus. They had even seen the dead raised, but they had never seen anything like the resurrected Jesus, raised by his own power, more charismatic, more radiant, more captivating than ever. Jesus spent a lot of time with them over the next several weeks, teaching them, comforting them, healing them. For Simon, the time both crawled and flew. He felt as if he lived an eternity in a single second. He learned more about God, the scriptures, about the kingdom, about himself than he'd ever imagined possible. He learned that zeal was good, but a poor substitute for meekness. He learned that joy was not found through might and conquest, but through humility and sacrifice. He learned that categories like best and worst were often different when viewed from heaven's perspective. He learned that it was better to be disappointed by Jesus than to be satisfied without him. He learned that he should never settle for his own kingdom when Jesus' kingdom was available to him. Several weeks after Jesus rose from the dead, he took his disciples for a walk through the old city, past the temple, across the Kidron Valley, and up the side of the Mount of Olives. Simon walked a little bit back from the crowd, his head down, his eyes on the ground, as he struggled to process everything that had happened to him. He wasn't the same man who'd walked this road weeks earlier. Wrapped up in his own thoughts, it took him a few moments to realize that someone had dropped back from the rest of the group. Looking up, he saw Jesus walking beside him. For some time, they just walked together, neither of them saying anything, because some moments are just too good to cheapen with words. After a time, Jesus placed his hand on Simon's arm, and the two of them stopped in the middle of the road. Jesus reached into the pocket of his tunic and he grabbed something. He extended his hand, a rough, strong hand, a stonemason's hand, with a clean but very real scar near the wrist where someone had recently driven a nail clean through. He opened up his hand, palm up, and there was Simon's coin, palm branches catching the morning light. "Would you like it back?" Jesus asked. Simon realized that they were standing in the exact spot where Jesus had taken it from him in the first place. He stood for a moment, blinking back the tears before he responded. "No, I think it's better with you." Jesus smiled, his eyes sparkling like stars. "Then I'll invest it for you. Who knows what it might turn into?" Simon lay on the cold stone floor in that small room behind that door with no handle, and his heart soared. He heard the sound of voices, footsteps echoing, stopping just on the other side of the door, the sound of metal clinking against metal, a key turning, hinges creaking. Simon rose to his feet, his arms no longer weary, his body no longer aching. He had never felt stronger. As the door swung open, Simon whispered one last time, "Your kingdom over mine." He couldn't wait to see what his coin had become.